hello. Another little laptop talk playlist video, but these are the ones I'm putting up on Twitter under my pinned tweet, using all these modern fancy things, having been, encouraged a little more towards that sort of thing, and the cyber world in general since the wonderful Corona COVID lessons for humanity, which maybe I'll talk about another time. Today, nice easy topic, maturity. Alright, so once upon a time, maturity wasn't something that Tantrikas had to talk about much, or it just happened. If we go back 1,000 or 2,500 years to the time of the Buddha said that in his time, humanity had lost maturity to the point where it was maturing, the average human was maturing to round about a natural 100. In other words, more or less in accordance with the physicality. According to the Buddha, the capacity, the human capacity, the level of maturity which could be reached was 80,000 years. And once upon a time, the average humanity attained that. Now, these Orientals do love their large numbers, Oriental spiritual people anyway, so that 80,000, well, wow, okay. Given the accuracy of the rest of his prediction, maybe it's spot on, who knows. The rest of his prediction was that following his time up to our time, 2,500 years later, humanity's maturity would continue to fall. Now at the 100-year maturity for the average human, that's the point at which the Buddha said people can do with a little help. Hence teachers appear. Hence the style of teaching that he came with, the authoritative patriarch, master knows, master tells you what to do, etc. And that worked, and he gave that, what he called that wheel of a Dharma, a big push. He gave it a lot of energy. So his disciples were asking him about, the future, saying 2,500 years from now, will all humanity be enlightened on account of our efforts? And he said, oops, I'm afraid not. That maturity is going to decline and decline and decline, and 2,500 years hence now, the average in humanity will only mature to that of a 10-year-old, a natural 10. That's the maturity they'll die at. He said they'd get married at a maturity of a 5-year-old. I remember when I encountered that teaching, I looked on it rather skeptically. I was married at the time, and I figured myself for pretty damn mature with my kids that I was raising and the career I was holding down, and everything, moderately respectable and so on. But I took it to heart a little, considered a bit, thought about the first 5 years of that marriage and the quality of argumentation we had, the kinds of issues that were triggered, what age that stuff showed maturity-wise. And I was kind of embarrassed, and I did have to admit that really, as far as I could remember, the causes and the sources of arguments, they really did seem to be, 5-year-old playground stuff, who's my best friend, or I'm feeling betrayed, I can't do what I want to do, very immature stuff. So that was a little bit of an impetus for me in my own life to look at things and shift it a bit. Now, fortunately, for me, considering the difficulty of helping people notice that this may perhaps be the case, that the average fellow perhaps nowadays matures not much, or doesn't reach the point of puberty maturity-wise. And that sounds a little unbelievable, but the nice thing that happened for me as a teacher of this, we take the good out of whatever we can find, was the Trump era, the Trump fellow. And he's a symptom. I'm not picking on the man. A poor fellow. No, everyone else has a great time with that. But just as an example of, here is the fellow chosen by the vote of really pretty much the richest, certainly the biggest, most militarily powerful, global encompassing empire country in the world, the United States of America. And this is what the people of the United States of America chose as their leader. So he's representative of them, like it or not, to a great extent. You can say, he conned them. Well, he's a representative of how they can be conned in that case. Nonetheless, what he does for me is he makes convincing people about this level of maturity thing a hell of a lot easier, because look at his level of maturity. Come on. Excited about getting away with grabbing a girl. That's 12 years old? Maybe, if we're generous, yeah? Some would say maybe 13, maybe, which would mark him as, the average. If the average matures to 10, there's your bell curve. Well, Trump's maybe is a little bit over the tip of that bell curve. He's in the belly of the bell curve, the bulk of humanity. Sure, the, extremes in both directions will always exist, but when we're talking of humanity, we talk about the belly of the bell curve moving, in this case, moving maturity-wise, whoops, down the scale. And look at Trump, leader of the free world, maturity of a 14-year-old. Once upon a time, back in Buddha's day, the pace, the natural sort of maturation rate, meant the pace of it, this is old tantric data from way back when, that those who have no attention for the path whatsoever, they make no effort whatsoever to work on, improve themselves, inquire into what they are, seek the great answers, face their triggerings and get through to the other side, resist every constraint they feel upon themselves. Those without that stuff going on, just the regular average shepherd who's born a shepherd, happy to stay a shepherd, happy to be a shepherd, and works his whole life as a shepherd, for example. By 50 years of sex life, so typically 65-ish, such people, anyone, had attained that level of maturity, 60, 65 years of maturity. Typically, sexuality, maybe they still had it, maybe they were still really interested in it, but it had dropped off considerably. They weren't chasing things. If you sat with such a fellow and had a discussion, he would meet you as you were, responsively, more or less in the moment. Because in 50 years of sex life, in other words, 50 years of, in a way, saying yes at some level at least, to some level of desire, that would be enough to trigger all the buffer of things put away through childhood, get him up to date, get him to the condition we can call living in the moment, which is a certain point of maturity, 50, 60-ish, in terms of natural years. And he could meet you as you were. He's not meeting you from, what you trigger in him, and the backlog, and his filters and his constraints and his suppressions of that, and then what comes out. No, he just meets you. This is why many cultures still, Korean culture is a beautiful example, African culture in Africa, it's fading here, but the reverence we used to have, and some still have a little, but for age as such, came from that. Nowadays we see 78-year-olds, still chasing girls, still running around all excited, still terribly excited by anything sexual, still, laughing about misogynistic and little boy, school day style jokes and that kind of stuff. And we see them dying, not in acceptance, but we see them putting away the fear of dying for later, asking the doctors to do everything they can for them in those last 3 months when they know they're dying. And in those last 3 months, they give 80% of what they're going to give in their entire lives to a medical profession. They give it in the last 3 months. Out of that terror of just the naturalness of now it's time to die. People that were on the path, people of intent, that had what they call the monastic capacity. They can dedicate to a course of study for 7 years or a lifetime or whatever in terms of monastic vows, joining a spiritual community, that kind of thing. Those who are intent about it. We're not talking, the first guys, Sunday church goes to stay cool. Why do you go to church? Well, because people look at me funny and they might not serve me in the shops if I don't. It used to be the motivation for them. Those who go to church, yes, but also get time with the priest and fiercely debate with a circle of friends and so on, and join a spiritual school and study and so on. That kind of a monastic sort of capacity. Those got through the process of maturation to that sort of somewhere between 50 and 70 mark of being able to meet life responsively without a backlog, meeting it in the moment, living in the moment. They used to reach that in 20, 22 years. That was the sort of expected standard, 22 years for a monk's path. And then the tantric is 6 years, 7 years. So those on the super accelerated, hyper fast path, unguided, unstructured, fully exposed to the chaos of life in all its forms path. That's what Tantra is all about. They really get through that backlog quickly. Get through it in 6 years, 7 years. And then imagine being at the point of meeting life responsively, meeting life as it is, truly living in the moment by, 25, 30, that kind of age. And of course tantrikas these days, you don't see that much because, I suppose on one level, just because it's really hard to soar like an eagle if you're surrounded by a bunch of turkeys. And given that the average of humanity isn't going to reach the point of puberty, which is the point at which one starts addressing the backlog, the buffer, clearing the buffer, catching up on all the feelings put away for later throughout the whole childhood. Puberty is the time that desire takes one out there into the world and to get your triggerings, get your past felt and finished. But of course nowadays people are protecting those triggerings. The culture even supports that people have trigger warnings before they encounter something that might be scary, might trigger something from their past, might make them feel really uncomfortable. And they die putting away that fear of death. So they never get around to really to the puberty point of maturity. So living with that's the environment. Tantrikas these days tend to have a late start. However, they don't go slowly. One thing that really blew me away when I was just starting my first year or two of teaching was the pace at which I saw my students advance through that territory, the rate at which they caught up to their natural maturity was stunning. Still is. That's really why it's become part of my teaching. I mean, in a sense, teaching the path to maturity is none of my business. Tantra is kind of supposed to start round about when, you've had your life as a householder, you've made your children, you've lived a full sexuality and life, and now you really want to expand on that. And sure, I have students that's where we play. But for most, and for people with, all the energies, all the signs, all the power that comes in that sort of fifth of 2% of people that find me, that have an interest in this path, just because of that eagles and turkeys factor, they're more mature generally than the average fellow will reach in his life, but they're well in the puberty stage of things, but they're constrained in it. They're not moving in the kind of things I have to work with them are around them letting themselves know more deeply their desires, letting themselves find in themselves the permission to know, to explore, to go into areas where they feel their triggers, where they have maybe even mastered overcoming their triggers, and disassemble that whole defense, regain their vulnerability, let the past be caught up. It's just like a buffer in a computer that's got to purge before you can get to being responding to now. Well, in your childhood you don't have much capacity. Tons of stuff put away for later. Later you get triggers from puberty on to feel it and get it felt and get it finished. And most people these days, if they engage with that dance at all, they engage on the level of stopping it, of stopping their desires, of doing affirmations and bombing their poor subconscious with desires that they want to create for themselves, rather than the inconvenient desires that are natural and arising and are their path of life. So sympathies, Tantra flavor people, if you find yourselves in that kind of eagle surrounded by turkeys situation. I'm not saying it by way of running down the turkeys. They are what they are. They've got to do what they've got to do. There are perfectly good reasons why humanity is in the general, in the main, immature right now. Buddha never said it was a problem. He just said style of teaching would have to change and a few other things, which maybe we talk about in another one of these little videos sometime. Yeah, let me know on Twitter if you want to argue or fight about this or get into any back and forth on any level. I mean, I'll just ignore it if I don't like it. I mean, no, I'll probably engage with it if I like it or don't like it. If I'm really neutral, who knows? Whatever. But this is enough for today.